Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that seems to be
Sure.
kind of floating around out there,
All right.
and that is, can Christian democracy offer any solutions to the social and political issues that are facing America today?
Interesting.
And we've got a really fascinating set of sources
Okay.
that help us unpack this. We have a 1904 treatise by Albert Denser,
All right.
and it's simply titled Christian Democracy.
Okay.
And then we have a modern analysis called Christian Democracy and American Renewal.
Gotcha.
So we're going to have this juxtaposition between a historical perspective and a contemporary one, which
Sure.
should be really interesting.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, what's changed and what's stayed the same
Exactly.
over the last century or so.
Yeah, and one of the things that jumps out right away from both sources is this idea of a crisis of, and
Right.
I'm going to use Denser's words here, base selfishness.
Oh, wow.
He even calls it an antichrist spirit at one point.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty strong language, right?
Pretty strong words.
Yeah.
But, getting beyond that sort of fiery language,
Yeah.
this concept that rampant self-interest
Mm.
is at the root of a lot of our problems. I mean, that might sound like a sweeping generalization,
Right.
but as I was reading it, it really did get me thinking. I mean, does that resonate with you at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating how Denser, writing over a century ago,
Mm-hmm.
seems to tap into some of the same anxieties that we grapple with today.
Right.
And I think the modern analysis really brings this point home by connecting it to specific issues like we see today,
Mm-hmm.
like economic inequality,
Yeah.
the social fragmentation that we see where people are increasingly isolated,
Yeah.
and of course the political polarization that we see.
Totally.
These are all areas where you could argue that individual self-interest
Yeah.
very much trumps the common good.
Yeah, it's like he was predicting this hyper-competitive, everyone for themselves mentality. He even talks about this struggle for survival, pushing
Really?
people to fight, struggle, cheat, and hypocrite, just to get ahead. I mean, it's kind of a bleak picture, but does it ring true?
Well, I think if you think about it,
Yeah.
if you're constantly battling for resources,
Right.
for status,
Mm-hmm.
for a piece of the pie, does that foster a sense of shared purpose and working together
Mm.
for the benefit of all?
Right.
Or does it breed resentment, division,
Yeah.
and ultimately a society where it's every man for himself?
It's every man for himself. And that brings us to, I think, one of the most thought-provoking arguments in both sources.
Okay.
And that is this critique of majority rule.
All right.
Now, I gotta admit, when I first read Denser, just flat out saying that majority rule is inherently flawed, I kind of did a double take.
Really?
It just felt so radical to me. He goes as far as to say that it prevents a true brotherhood of man. So what do you make of that argument?
Well, I think it's important to understand the context here.
Right.
Denser isn't simply advocating for minority rights.
Mm-hmm.
He's arguing that a system built on winners and losers,
Right.
on constantly pitting one group against another,
Yeah.
fundamentally undermines the unity and cooperation that he sees as essential for a truly Christian society.
Mm.
And it's not simply about protecting the minority. It's about creating a system where everyone's voice is valued
Gotcha.
and where decisions are made with the well-being of all in mind,
Okay.
not just those who happen to have the most votes.
It's definitely a different way of thinking about democracy and maybe a bit uncomfortable for those of us who were raised on the idea of majority rule.
Sure.
But it does make you wonder, has majority rule really led to the ideal society that we imagine? Are we truly living in a brotherhood of man, or are we more divided than ever?
It's a complex question, and there's no easy answers.
Yeah.
But I think what Denser's critique does is it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the limitations of majority rule.
Okay.
Does simply having more votes automatically mean you have the morally right answer? Does it guarantee that the needs of everyone, especially the most vulnerable, will be taken into account?
Okay. Interesting.
These are the questions I think that both sources are prompting us to grapple with.
And this is where Denser throws us a curveball.
Okay.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Right.
His proposed solutions. Buckle up, because here we go. Instead of elections as we know them, he advocates for a system where public officials are chosen based on a combination of qualification exams
Okay.
and then, wait for it, a random lottery.
Wow.
It's like he's saying, forget the popularity contest, forget the slick campaigns. Let's just leave it up to chance and merit. I can only imagine what people would say today.
Right.
So you're saying my vote doesn't matter, just leave it up to a lottery.
Right.
What are we to make of this seemingly outlandish proposition?
Now, before we dismiss Denser as completely bonkers, let's try to understand the reasoning behind this.
Okay.
He was deeply concerned about the corruption and self-interest that he saw plaguing the political systems of his time.
So he was right.
Remember, this was an era of widespread political machines,
Oh.
vote buying, and all sorts of shenanigans.
Yeah.
So he believed that by taking the campaigning and the power grabbing out of the equation, you could create a system where leaders were truly chosen based on their qualifications
Right.
and their commitment to serving the common good.
So it's less about the lottery itself and more about trying to level the playing field, get rid of the influence of money and power. I can see how this might appeal to people today who are disillusioned with the current system.
Yeah, I think. There's definitely a sense of frustration with the status quo.
I mean, how many times have we heard people say, they're all crooks anyway.
Right.
What difference does it make who we vote for? Is Denser tapping into something there?
Absolutely.
Even if his solution seems extreme.
Yeah, and then he takes it a step further.
Okay.
He doesn't just want to change who gets elected. He wants to fundamentally alter how laws are made.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that's where we get to his even more radical proposal. No more majority votes in legislatures.
What?
So how on earth are they supposed to pass any law?
Hold on to your hats, because Denser envisioned a system where laws could only be passed by unanimous agreement. Unanimous? That's ambitious, to say the least. I mean, it seems practically impossible to get everyone to agree on anything these days.
Well, that's precisely Denser's point.
Right.
He believed that by forcing lawmakers to find common ground, to truly consider the needs and perspectives of all members of society, this was the only way to ensure that laws reflected genuine moral principles
Okay.
and benefited everyone, not just the majority.
Wow, so that's quite a vision. I mean, imagine a world where every single law that was passed had to have the support of every single representative. Talk about a high bar.
Right.
Makes you wonder if such a system could even function in the real world.
It's certainly a provocative proposal and one that raises a whole host of questions. Could it work in practice? What are the potential drawbacks? Are there any historical examples of consensus-based governance that we can learn from?
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, does it offer any valuable insights for how we might improve our own systems today?
And those are all great questions, and I think they lead us perfectly to the modern source and their perspective. Because as you might imagine, things have shifted a bit in the past century.
Yeah.
The modern analysis takes a slightly different tack. They're focusing more on how Christian democratic principles can be applied to the specific challenges that we face today.
Makes sense.
So let's shift gears a bit and explore that perspective.
Let's do it. So Denser, gives us this really thought-provoking framework, albeit radical as it may be. The modern source brings us back down to earth a little bit by focusing on, what Christian democracy could look like in practice here and now. And what I find interesting is that instead of dwelling on specific political systems, it really zeroes in on those core principles that we touched on earlier, like human dignity, social solidarity, and economic justice.
Yeah, it's almost like they took Denser's big picture critique and said, okay, how do we actually apply this to the messy world we live in?
Exactly.
And they don't shy away from the tough stuff,
Yeah. No, they don't. And so let's dig into some of those concrete solutions that they propose.
Okay.
One of the first things that jumps out at me is their emphasis on the importance of community.
Yeah.
It might seem like a really simple idea,
Yeah.
but they argue that rebuilding strong, vibrant communities is absolutely foundational to achieving a more just and equitable society.
You know, we hear a lot about community these days, but what do you think they mean by that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I think we can all picture that idyllic small town where everybody knows each other, helps each other out.
Yeah.
There's this real sense of belonging.
Yeah.
But the reality is, many of us live in increasingly fragmented, atomized societies. So how do we bridge that gap?
Right.
The modern source offers some really interesting insights here.
Okay.
They talk about the need to strengthen local institutions.
Okay.
Things like, supporting local journalism,
Yeah.
revitalizing civic organizations and clubs, even just creating more welcoming public spaces where people can connect.
I love that idea of supporting local journalism because it makes sense. When you have a shared source of reliable information, it creates a common ground for discussion and debate.
Absolutely.
It helps people understand the issues and then work together to find solutions.
And it's not just about staying informed. It's about that sense of shared identity, of being invested in the well-being of your community.
Right.
Think about the role that local newspapers,
Yeah.
radio stations, even online forums play in these small towns.
Yeah.
They become these vital hubs for information, for debate, for connecting with your neighbors.
Totally.
And I think the modern source argues that.
Yeah.
We need to be really intentional about fostering that kind of civic engagement,
Yeah.
even in larger, more diverse communities.
And it's not just about information, right? It's about those face-to-face interactions, those opportunities to break out of our silos and build relationships with people who might be different from us.
Absolutely.
So that's where things like community gardens come into play, book clubs, volunteer groups. Just having a vibrant local park or library,
Exactly.
it creates those informal spaces where people can come together around shared interests and build those bonds of community.
And this connects back to Denser's idea of a brotherhood of man.
Yeah.
It's not about imposing some kind of uniformity. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, our interdependence, and working together for the common good.
It takes a village.
Exactly.
We need to rediscover that power of collective action, of looking out for one another, creating that safety net that catches those who might fall through the cracks.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to another key theme in the modern source, the importance of supporting families, which in our very individualistic go-it-alone culture feels almost revolutionary.
I think it's definitely a shift in perspective because we often think about family as this private domain that's separate from the political sphere.
Right.
But the modern source argues that if we truly value human dignity and the well-being of all members of society, we have to start by supporting families. Because families are the building blocks of society.
Right.
They're where we learn those essential values of love, compassion, responsibility.
So what happens when families are struggling? What are the ripple effects of that?
Well, you see it everywhere, don't you?
Yeah.
You see it in increased poverty, crime, mental health issues.
Yeah.
When families are stressed, when parents are stretched too thin, it impacts everyone.
Right.
And that's why the modern source calls for policies that actually support families.
Totally.
Things like paid family leave, affordable child care, flexible work arrangements.
Like basic stuff that most other developed countries already have.
Right.
But it feels like in the U.S., we're still stuck in this model where families are just expected to fend for themselves.
Exactly.
No matter how difficult things get.
And I think that goes back to that idea of base selfishness that Denser talked about.
Yeah.
We've created a system that prioritizes individual achievement. Economic growth over the well-being of families and communities. And the modern source is challenging us to rethink that.
Right.
To really ask ourselves what it would mean to create a society where families can thrive, not just survive.
Yeah, investing in families isn't just this touchy-feely, nice-to-have thing. It's a smart investment in the future of our society.
Absolutely.
Strong families raise strong kids who become strong citizens who contribute to strong communities.
It's all interconnected.
It's all connected. And speaking of raising strong citizens, the modern source also highlights the crucial role of civic education. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Oh, no, not another lecture about the importance of voting. But it goes beyond that. It's about equipping young people with the knowledge, the skills, and the values to be active and engaged participants in a democratic society.
It's about instilling that sense of responsibility that Denser was talking about.
Right.
That we all have a role to play in shaping our communities and holding our leaders accountable.
Exactly. And that requires more than just knowing the three branches of government. It's about fostering critical thinking skills, the ability to engage in civil discourse, to understand and appreciate different perspectives.
Absolutely. It's about creating citizens who are not just informed, but empowered.
Yes.
Citizens who understand their rights and responsibilities, who can see through propaganda and misinformation, who are willing to speak up and advocate for what they believe in.
Right. It's about creating a generation that's not just inheriting a system, but actively shaping it, improving it, making it more just and equitable for everyone.
That's the kind of civic education that can truly strengthen our democracy.
And speaking of justice, I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room.
All right.
Economic inequality.
Right.
Because let's be real for a second. Strong communities supportive families, informed citizens, that's all great, but it's really hard to focus on any of that when you're
Right.
struggling to make ends meet, when you're worried about putting food on the table or keeping a roof over your head.
Absolutely.
And the modern source doesn't shy away from this.
No, they don't. They make it very clear
Mm-hmm.
that economic justice is absolutely central to the Christian democratic vision.
And they don't just throw out these vague platitudes about fairness or opportunity.
They get into the nitty-gritty
Hmm.
of what a more just economic system would look like.
They do.
For example, they talk about promoting worker ownership,
Okay.
which I find fascinating. Imagine a world where more businesses were structured as co-ops,
Yeah.
where the profits were shared more equitably among the workforce.
When I first read that, I thought, is that even possible? Can we really shift away from this shareholder-centric model that seems so ingrained in our economy?
Right.
But then the more I thought about it, the more intriguing it became. Because at the end of the day, who creates the wealth in a company? It's the workers.
And is the workers.
So why shouldn't they have a greater say in how the company is run and how the profits are distributed?
And it's not just about fairness for workers.
Mm-hmm.
It's about creating a more stable and sustainable system overall.
Okay.
When workers have a stake in their company's success, they're more invested.
Right.
They're more productive,
Right.
and they're less likely to be exploited.
It's a win-win.
It is a win-win.
Why isn't this more widespread? I mean, there are successful co-ops out there,
There are.
but they're a relatively small part of the overall economy.
Yeah. What are the barriers to scaling this up? What would it take to create a system that truly supports worker ownership and empowers employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a model that I think deserves more attention, especially with the growing concerns about economic inequality and worker exploitation.
Absolutely. And it's not just about worker ownership. The modern source also talks about regional development,
Okay.
investing in those communities that have been left behind, creating jobs and opportunities where they're desperately needed.
Right. It's about creating a more balanced economy where prosperity isn't concentrated in just a few areas or among a select few individuals. Everyone deserves a chance to contribute, to build good life for themselves and their families. And that means addressing those systemic inequalities that have created these pockets of poverty and despair.
Absolutely.
It means investing in infrastructure, education, job training, all those things that create a fertile ground for opportunity to flourish.
And all of this, the modern source emphasizes, must be done with an eye toward environmental stewardship.
Okay.
Because what good is economic prosperity if we're destroying the planet?
Right.
We can't talk about creating a just and equitable society without addressing the climate crisis,
Yeah.
the depletion of natural resources,
Yeah.
the pollution that's poisoning our air and water.
Right. It's all interconnected. Our actions have consequences,
Right, too.
and we have a moral obligation to care for the planet and for future generations.
A big task.
It is, and
Right.
it can feel overwhelming at times.
And it can. So where do we even begin?
Right.
How do we shift from this short-term, self-interested mindset to a more long-term, holistic view of what it means to build a truly sustainable and just society?
Right. That's the question, isn't it?
It is. And I think it's a question that both sources,
Yeah.
despite their differences in approach and tone, are ultimately grappling with.
Right.
Denser's call for a radical restructuring of our political and economic systems
Yeah.
might seem like a distant echo from the past, but his core critique that our systems are driven by self-interest rather than a genuine concern for the common good still resonates very powerfully today.
It does.
And the modern source offers a more grounded and practical roadmap, but it's ultimately asking us to confront that same fundamental question.
What kind of society do we want to live in?
Exactly.
And how do we get there? So we've covered a lot of ground, but
Yeah.
it feels like we've just scratched the surface. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road. The modern source does offer some very specific suggestions
Okay.
for political reforms that could help move us in this direction.
Right.
Things like electoral reform, institutional reform, and promoting civic dialogue.
Okay, I'm ready to tackle those.
Let's do it.
So we talked about the big ideas, the challenges, and the vision of a society that is really grounded in Christian democratic principles. But I want to get down to brass tacks.
All right.
What can actually be done to make this vision a reality? The modern source lays out some pretty specific political reforms, and
Yeah.
some of them, I gotta say, are pretty bold.
What real change rarely happens without shaking things up a bit.
That's true.
And I think the modern source acknowledges that,
Uh-huh.
we're not just talking about tinkering around the edges.
Right.
This is about addressing some fundamental flaws
Yeah.
in our political systems.
Exactly. So let's break it down.
Yeah.
They have a three-pronged approach here. Electoral reform, institutional reform, and promoting civic dialogue.
That's good.
Where should we start?
Let's tackle electoral reform first.
Okay.
Because as we discussed earlier with Denser's critique, how we choose our leaders has a huge impact on the kind of society that we create. And the modern source isn't pulling any punches here.
No, they're calling for some pretty big changes.
They advocate for things like ranked choice voting and overhauling campaign finance.
It's like they took all the complaints
Yeah.
that people have about our current system and said, yeah, okay, let's actually fix this.
Right.
But do you think these proposals have any real chance of gaining traction?
Well, it's certainly an uphill battle,
Mm-hmm.
given the entrenched interests and partisan gridlock that we see. But I think what's important is that these ideas are being put forward,
Okay.
that people are starting to recognize the need for fundamental reform. And there are actually some encouraging signs out there.
Like what?
Well, ranked choice voting, for example,
Mm-hmm.
has been implemented in several cities and states with some promising results.
I'm not super familiar with
Right.
how ranked choice voting works.
Okay, so it's pretty simple. Instead of just picking one candidate, voters rank their choices in order of preference.
Okay.
And if no candidate gets a majority of first choice votes, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. And then their votes are redistributed to the voters' second choices. And this process continues until one candidate has a majority.
So you're encouraging candidates to appeal to a broader range of voters
Exactly.
and potentially reducing polarization.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense. So ranked choice voting. What about campaign finance reform?
Yeah, that feels like a much bigger beast to tackle. Absolutely.
Well, it's no secret that money has become this dominant force in our politics.
It has. And the modern source is very clear about the need to address this.
So what do they propose?
Well, they advocate for things like limiting campaign contributions,
Okay.
increasing transparency in political spending, and really strengthening enforcement of existing laws.
So making sure elections are decided by ideas, by the will of the people, not by who can outspend the other,
Right.
but realistically, how do we unravel this web of influence that we've created?
It's definitely a challenge, but I don't think it's insurmountable. I mean, we've seen successful campaign finance reform in the past, and there are a number of really innovative proposals out there. For example, some advocate for publicly financed elections, where candidates receive a set amount of funding from the government,
Interesting.
eliminating the need for private donations.
Okay.
Others are pushing for stricter disclosure requirements so that voters can clearly see who's funding these campaigns and what their agendas might be.
It's about shining a light on the dark corners of our political systems.
Absolutely.
But we've seen enough scandals and corruption to last a lifetime.
You're absolutely right. And restoring integrity and accountability to our political system have to be a top priority.
Okay.
The modern source calls for strengthening ethics rules for both elected officials and lobbyists, and for creating a culture where ethical behavior is expected and enforced.
But how do you enforce that?
Well, that's where transparency and accountability come in. When decisions are made in the open, when there's a clear paper trail, it's much harder for corruption to flourish. And when there are strong oversight mechanisms and real consequences for wrongdoing, it creates this deterrent effect.
So it's not just about doing the right thing. It's about doing the smart thing.
Exactly.
I like that. But electoral reform is just one piece of the puzzle, right? We also have to look at our institutions, how they're structured, how they function.
Right. It's not enough to just elect good people. We need to create systems that encourage ethical behavior, that promote efficiency, and foster a sense of public trust.
So what does that look like?
Well, it covers a wide range of areas, from streamlining bureaucratic processes to strengthening oversight mechanisms. And they talk about the need for modernization, using technology to improve the delivery of services and making government more responsive to citizens' needs.
Making it work better.
Exactly.
We've all had those frustrating experiences with bureaucracy, with red tape, just feeling like a cog in the machine.
Right.
How do we make government more human-centered?
Well, I think a key element is transparency. The more open and accessible our institutions are, the less room there is for shady dealings. and backroom deals.
Yeah.
The modern source emphasizes the importance of open data, public records requests, and making information about government activities readily available.
It's about empowering citizens to hold their government accountable. They have to
Exactly.
understand how decisions are made
Yeah.
and who's influencing those decisions, along with transparency. We need strong oversight mechanisms,
Absolutely.
independent watchdogs, ethics committees, processes for investigating complaints.
Yes, creating a system of checks and balances
Yeah.
that prevents the abuse of power.
And of course, we can't talk about institutional reform
Wrong.
without talking about anti-corruption measures.
Absolutely. Corruption is a cancer.
It is, that can eat away at the fabric of our society.
And the modern source is very clear
Yeah.
about the need to address this head on.
Okay.
They advocate for things like strengthening whistleblower protections,
Yes.
creating independent anti-corruption agencies, and increasing penalties for those who engage in corrupt practices.
Sending a message
Yeah.
that corruption will not be tolerated.
Exactly.
It's not just about punishment, though, right?
No, it's about creating a culture of integrity,
Okay.
where ethical behavior is the norm, not the exception.
And that brings us to the third prong. Promoting civic dialogue.
Right.
Lasting change happens when people are engaged and informed and willing to have those tough conversations about what kind of society we want to live in.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond the shouting matches, the partisan gridlock, creating spaces where people can come together, listen to each other, and work collaboratively to find solutions.
It's about recognizing that we all have something to contribute.
We do.
We can learn from each other, and even when we disagree, we can do so respectfully and productively.
It's about tapping into that collective wisdom, that shared desire for a better future.
That's a powerful message, and I think it really speaks to the heart of that Christian democratic vision. It's not just about structures and systems, it's about values.
It is.
It's about human dignity,
Yeah.
social responsibility, a commitment to justice and the common good.
It's about creating a society where everyone has an opportunity to flourish.
It's a challenging vision, but it's also an incredibly hopeful one, suggesting that a better future is possible.
It is.
But it requires all of us to step up to engage and to work together to make it happen. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this question. What role are you willing to play in building that better future? What actions can you take to make a difference in your community, in your country, in the world?
Yeah.
Because it's through those individual acts of courage, compassion, and commitment that real change takes root.